Don't believe the hype about America's economic miracle, Trump's sugar rush, and the $7 trillion bill that's coming due. At 10:23 a.m. on March 15th, 2025, Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent walked into the Oval Office carrying a classified briefing that would make any economist's blood run cold. The document, marked Eyes Only, contained projections showing that if Trump's full economic agenda was implemented, America would face a choice by 2027, either slash Social Security and Medicare by 40%, or raise taxes on middle-class families to levels not seen since World War II. Within 72 hours, that document had disappeared from Treasury servers, classified above top secret, and Bessent was publicly declaring the American economy stronger than ever. But here's what most analysts missed. This wasn't about fiscal responsibility or economic theory. This wasn't even about politics, despite the partisan headlines. This was about the Madman Doctrine. And if you think this is just another tax cut debate, I'm going to show you why this might be the most dangerous economic gamble in American history. I've spent years analyzing fiscal crisis patterns, and what we're witnessing in America isn't economic policy. It's weaponized bankruptcy disguised as prosperity. The numbers tell the story. In 2024, America's national debt was $33.7 trillion. By December 2025, it hit $39.2 trillion. That's a $5.5 trillion increase in 12 months. Today, America borrows $47,000 per second just to pay for government operations. Let me put that another way. Every heartbeat, every blink, every breath you take costs America $47,000 in new debt that future generations will inherit. But debt statistics are abstractions. Let me show you what this looks like on the ground. In September 2025, Trump signed the Prosperity Forever Act, eliminating federal taxes on tips, overtime, and Social Security benefits while making the 2017 tax cuts permanent. This isn't modest fiscal adjustment. We're talking about $480 billion in annual revenue elimination with no corresponding spending cuts except Elon Musk's $180 billion in efficiency savings, one-time cuts that reduced federal employment by 340,000 workers but created no sustainable revenue replacement. Here's the significance. America now operates with a structural deficit of $2.8 trillion annually, money that must be borrowed from foreign creditors to keep the lights on. But the real kicker isn't the borrowing, it's who's lending. China holds $1.1 trillion in U.S. Treasury bonds. Japan holds $940 billion. Saudi Arabia holds $280 billion. America's economic prosperity literally depends on countries that Trump simultaneously threatens with tariffs, sanctions, and military pressure. But fiscal deficits are just the visible infrastructure. Let me tell you about the invisible kind. The Federal Reserve has been forced into a policy straitjacket called financial repression, keeping interest rates artificially low to prevent debt service costs from consuming the entire federal budget. At current debt levels, each 1% increase in interest rates costs America $390 billion annually in additional debt service. Jerome Powell faces an impossible choice: raise rates to fight inflation and trigger federal bankruptcy, or keep rates low and watch currency debasement accelerate. By 2025, 23.7% of all federal spending goes to debt service. More than defense, more than education, more than infrastructure. America has become a hedge fund attached to a military, borrowing money to pay interest on money it already borrowed. They now call it the Madman Doctrine, Trump's strategy to use economic chaos as a negotiating weapon. Let me break down what this Madman Doctrine actually means in practice. First, fiscal discipline becomes a weapon of mass economic destruction. Trump discovered that threatening to default on national debt gives America leverage over creditors who can't afford American bankruptcy. When China reduced U.S. Treasury purchases in April 2025, Trump threatened to examine the full faith and credit obligations of the United States government. Translation: Pay our bills or we'll crash the global financial system and take everyone down with us. Second, inflation becomes a tool of debt liquidation. High inflation reduces the real value of existing debt, essentially allowing America to pay back creditors with devalued currency. The $39 trillion national debt becomes manageable if dollars are worth 30% less. It's theft disguised as monetary policy, but it works if you're big enough to survive the retaliation. Third, economic unpredictability becomes a form of asymmetric warfare. Businesses cannot plan when tax policy, trade rules, and regulatory frameworks change weekly. But large corporations with armies of lawyers and lobbyists adapt faster than foreign competitors. Economic chaos favors the economically powerful while crushing smaller players who lack flexibility. Fourth, fiscal irresponsibility becomes a strategic advantage. Countries with balanced budgets and sustainable debt levels watch helplessly as America outspends them on infrastructure, defense, and technology through unlimited borrowing. It's the economic equivalent of doping in sports, unsustainable but effective until the body breaks down. So where does this lead? Let me walk you through the pressure points that could trigger financial collapse. The Social Security death spiral. Social Security faces insolvency by 2027 without intervention. Trump's elimination of taxes on Social Security benefits reduces program revenue by $950 billion over 10 years while doing nothing to address demographic realities. The choice-facing lawmakers slash benefits by 35%, raise the retirement age to 72, or eliminate the cap on Social Security taxes, effectively creating a 70% marginal tax rate for high earners. The Medicare explosion represents a different challenge. Healthcare costs rise faster than economic growth in every developed country. America spends $4.3 trillion annually on healthcare, more than the entire GDP of Germany. Medicare costs alone will reach $1.8 trillion by 2030. Trump's promise to protect Medicare while cutting taxes creates a mathematical impossibility that must be resolved through either massive benefit cuts or currency debasement that makes healthcare unaffordable for everyone. But let me walk you through three specific scenarios that keep Treasury economists awake at night. Scenario 1, the creditor strike. By September 2026, China and Japan simultaneously reduced Treasury purchases by 40%. Citing fiscal sustainability concerns. Interest rates spike from 4.8% to 11.2% within 6 weeks. Debt service costs explode from $890 billion to $2.1 trillion annually. The federal government faces a choice: cut spending by $1.2 trillion immediately or default on obligations to bondholders. Social Security payments stop for 3 months. Federal employees go unpaid for 47 days. Stock markets crash 38%. Unemployment hits 12.4% as credit markets freeze. Scenario 2, the currency collapse. Faced with impossible debt service costs, the Federal Reserve expands the money supply by $8.4 trillion in 18 months to purchase Treasury bonds that private creditors refuse to buy. Inflation accelerates to 23% annually as currency debasement destroys savings. A gallon of gas costs $8.50. Grocery bills double every 14 months. Retirees on fixed incomes watch their purchasing power evaporate. Foreign governments abandon dollar-denominated transactions, accelerating the dollar's collapse. America becomes a middle-income country with nuclear weapons. Scenario 3, the austerity revolution. Congress implements emergency fiscal consolidation, cutting spending by $1.8 trillion and raising taxes by $900 billion to restore creditor confidence. Social Security benefits drop 42%. Medicare becomes a voucher system covering 60% of medical costs. Federal education funding disappears. Infrastructure spending stops entirely. Unemployment insurance expires after 12 weeks. 26 states declare fiscal emergencies and request federal bailouts that cannot be provided. Civil unrest spreads as middle-class Americans discover that their government cannot afford the promises it made. But the immediate crisis isn't spending, it's borrowing capacity. The Congressional Budget Office projects that by 2029, debt service will consume 37% of all federal revenue. America will borrow money just to pay interest on money it already borrowed. At that point, fiscal policy becomes impossible because every dollar of new spending requires $1.50 in borrowing, creating an exponential debt spiral that ends in currency collapse. The psychological warfare aspect creates additional complications. Trump deliberately cultivates uncertainty about American financial obligations, using default threats as negotiating leverage. But financial markets don't distinguish between strategic bluffing and genuine insolvency risk. When politicians threaten default for political advantage, creditors price in default probability regardless of intention. The international dimensions add complexity that domestic economists often ignore. China has begun requiring yuan payment for certain transactions. Saudi Arabia accepts Chinese currency for oil sales. Russia and Iran have developed payment systems that bypass the dollar entirely. These aren't anti-American policies. They're risk management strategies designed to protect national interests from American fiscal uncertainty. The European Union faces particular pressure. European banks hold massive quantities of American debt, making them vulnerable to American fiscal crisis. Germany has begun requiring stress testing for American debt exposure. France plans to reduce dollar reserves from 60% to 40% by 2030. Here's the question everyone should be asking. What happens when creditors stop lending? And the answer is brutally simple. America discovers whether military supremacy translates into financial immunity. China, Japan, and Saudi Arabia don't lend America money out of charity. They lend because U.S. Treasury bonds represent the safest store of value in an uncertain world. But safety depends on repayment credibility, and credibility evaporates when debt levels exceed mathematical possibility of repayment. When creditors conclude that America cannot honor its obligations, they stop buying Treasury bonds. When Treasury auctions fail, interest rates spike to levels that make borrowing impossible. That scenario forces America into a choice between three options: massive austerity that triggers revolution, currency debasement that destroys savings, or military coercion that turns allies into enemies. Historical precedent suggests all three happen simultaneously. We're already seeing the escalation playbook. Hours after China reduced Treasury purchases in April 2025, Trump threatened to seize Chinese assets in America to secure American financial interests. When the European Union expressed concern about American fiscal sustainability, Trump imposed 35% tariffs on European luxury goods until they learned to respect American economic sovereignty. This is the escalation trap, fiscal edition. America threatens economic chaos to maintain borrowing capacity. Creditors reduce lending to protect themselves from chaos. America escalates threats to restore creditor confidence. Each action justifies the other. Each response raises the stakes from economic pressure to military confrontation. But there's a deeper problem that politicians refuse to acknowledge. The Madman Doctrine only works if you're actually powerful enough to survive the consequences of madness. Nixon's nuclear threats worked because America could survive nuclear war better than the Soviet Union. Trump's fiscal threats assume America can survive economic collapse better than its creditors. That assumption may be wrong. China holds $3.2 trillion in foreign exchange reserves and runs a current account surplus. They can survive without American consumers longer than America can survive without Chinese creditors. Saudi Arabia has diversified away from dollar dependence through the BRICS payment system and yuan-denominated oil sales. Japan has begun repatriating overseas assets to reduce exposure to American fiscal risk. America's creditors are preparing for a world without American financial dominance. The question isn't whether they can survive American economic threats. The question is whether America can survive its creditors' inevitable retaliation. The domestic political implications are equally stark. The Madman Doctrine creates temporary prosperity through unsustainable borrowing, then blames subsequent economic collapse on foreign manipulation or domestic opposition. It's the political equivalent of a pyramid scheme. Early participants benefit while later participants pay the costs. Consider what happens when the sugar high ends. Social Security benefits get cut by 35%. Medicare coverage gets reduced to emergency services only. Interest rates spike to 12% as creditor confidence collapses. Unemployment hits 15% as government spending disappears. But Trump will blame China, Europe, or Democrats rather than acknowledge that fiscal laws exist regardless of political preference. The psychological dynamic is deliberate. Voters experience prosperity today and assume it will continue forever. When collapse comes, they demand scapegoats rather than accepting responsibility for supporting unsustainable policies. The Madman Doctrine exploits cognitive bias. People believe they deserve prosperity without cost, and someone else must be responsible when costs become unavoidable. What comes next depends entirely on timing. If global economic growth accelerates and inflation remains controlled, America might grow its way out of debt over 20 years through economic expansion rather than fiscal discipline. But if recession hits before growth solves the debt problem, America faces a choice between Zimbabwe-style hyperinflation or Argentina-style austerity riots. The window for soft landing closes rapidly. Every month of additional borrowing makes future adjustment more painful. Every quarter of delayed fiscal responsibility makes eventual collapse more likely. The Madman Doctrine assumes America can time the market perfectly, borrowing for exactly the right amount of time before creditor patience expires. Financial markets don't typically cooperate with political timelines. Confidence can evaporate in minutes when debt levels cross psychological thresholds that investors cannot define in advance but recognize instantly when crossed. Let me leave you with one final thought. The Madman Doctrine represents the ultimate test of American exceptionalism, the belief that economic laws don't apply to America because America writes the rules. But mathematical reality suggests that exceptionalism has limits. No empire in history has borrowed its way to permanent prosperity. Rome debased its currency to fund military expansion and civil spending until inflation destroyed the monetary system. Britain abandoned fiscal discipline to maintain global influence until creditors forced austerity that ended the empire. Argentina, Venezuela, Zimbabwe, Lebanon, every country that believed monetary sovereignty exempted them from fiscal responsibility discovered that reality doesn't negotiate. America may be different. Dollar dominance and military supremacy provide advantages that previous empires lacked. Nuclear weapons ensure that no coalition of creditors can enforce financial discipline through military conquest. American technological leadership creates economic value that may offset fiscal irresponsibility. But advantages aren't guarantees. Currency dominance depends on creditor confidence, which depends on repayment credibility. Military supremacy costs money that must be borrowed if taxes don't cover spending. Technological leadership requires investment that fiscal crisis makes impossible. The Madman Doctrine bets everything on a single proposition. America is too big to fail and too powerful to discipline. If that bet succeeds, future historians will study Trump's fiscal strategy as proof that economic rules don't apply to superpowers. If it fails, they'll study it as evidence that no country is exempt from mathematical reality. The stakes couldn't be higher, the timeline couldn't be shorter, and the outcome depends entirely on variables that no economist can predict with confidence. One thing I know for sure, this story is just beginning. The borrowing is accelerating, the threats are escalating, and somewhere in Treasury Department computer models that politicians refuse to read, the mathematics of fiscal collapse is calculating exactly when good intentions become impossible to sustain with borrowed money. The Madman Doctrine has weaponized debt. But debt doesn't care about strategy, tactics, or national greatness. It only cares about mathematics, and mathematics doesn't negotiate.